Hey there, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today I have with me Dee Marshall, and I'm excited, Dee, to introduce you to our audience. You are, I'd say just like almost like a literal rock star, except for figurative, I guess. So it's really great to have you here, and I'm excited to introduce you to our audience.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Dee, you've played a lot of different roles in your life, and I know now you have a number of different things that you do. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I'm the CEO of Diverse and Engage. So that's my the primary hat that I wear at Diverse and Engage, where we do leadership development and diversity work. So a lot of what is playing out in the public domain is a lot of what we do. So that's one hat that I wear. And then a number of other hats. I serve on the board for the National Association for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. A couple years ago, founded D&I Honors, where Congress meets culture, inclusion, and belonging, and also the curator of Diversity on the Hill. And yeah, just excited to get to do work that I love that blends with my passion, and my purpose, right? So that's really the business side.
Mm.
But I know you wanted to talk about much more and like some of the other things that are, my personal story, background, some of the things that have happened, I think, in the last year, which were really, I would say, grateful to have. I think the most recent was named the Future 50 of Black America, and then the top 50 people of color list. No, just in the last
This
6 months, which
insane.
I'm great. I'm just really, I'm humbled and grateful that people acknowledge or really have found the work that we do. And then top 25 influential Black women in business and so on and so forth. So that's a little bit about, background, I should say.
I mean, I if it weren't so loud, I'd just stand here and clap and cheer. Way to go, Dee. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And you have obviously evolved over time. Your voice, your influence, your voice of influence, if you will, has evolved over time. And this is where you're at right now. But for those of us who are sitting here going, how in the world does one get to that point? You weren't born and with all of these honors. So
No,
do you
no.
want to share a little bit about the background of the evolution of your voice of influence?
Yeah, yeah. You know what? I love the question, and I love the podcast and the brand. So yeah, I really started, I would say, early in my career, in my adult life. I had a defining moment. And the defining moment was after September 11th. I worked on Wall Street. Um, and that was really a defining moment, having worked in New York City on September 11th during, at the time where there was a terrorist attack. And the day after became a defining moment in my life. And I think that was the beginning of this journey of, to your point, how I got from where I was as working, in 9 to 5, a typical traditional sort of work life. I mean, I love the work that I did back then, but that's a long way from where I am now. Back then I worked in training and development, and I didn't know my passion. I didn't know my purpose at the time, but I quickly found out. So my journey has been a defining moment that led me down the path of seeking more meaning and purpose for my life. And in pursuing more meaning and purpose for my life, I found my passion, I found my purpose, and I found my voice. And I think whenever you pursue your purpose or meaning and purpose for your life, that's when you find your voice and you begin to attract other people and become an influencer, if you will. And so, I gave you the beginning or the defining moment that really launched me into a journey of, I founded a ministry, Girlfriends Pray, over 100,000 women following, right? And that became part of building a voice. I'd done a television show many years ago. I was the coach on the show. That became the beginning of me finding my voice. Um, let's see, and from there, I began speaking around the country. And that was part of me finding my voice and building influence. So I would say, again, from going into my 9 to 5 job that I loved in training and development, I was in leadership development, and then walking this path of finding my voice, it just became pursuing meaning and purpose,
Hmm.
and then everything kind of stacked from there, because people watch and they follow and they listen, and I think people want to follow people who are following their heart. People will follow when you are doing meaningful work or doing work that you love. At least it doesn't even have to be anything significant. So I hope that answers the question in terms of where and how I started.
Oh yeah, I love it. And just the amount of change that's taken place. It was fun as I was kind of doing some research for the interview. I was looking back at some of your old YouTube videos from like 10 years ago, and and so on, and through the years since then. And it's always interesting to me to see people grow and change. It's not like we start out knowing exactly what we want to say. It's
That's
not
right.
like we start out with the same kind of conviction in our voice that we have later on. And I think that's part of what I was really enjoying seeing with you. You always had some I guess conviction and clarity, but it seems to have even strengthened since then.
Yeah, yeah. And can I tell you a secret? I was
Please.
painfully shy. Like at that starting point of what I just shared with you, when I worked on Wall Street, like one of my first jobs, I was painfully shy up until, again, young 20s. But even when I worked on Wall Street, like during this defining moment, which was the sort of the launching pad, um, I still had my own insecurities. I didn't have a voice. I didn't know my voice. I didn't know my passion. So I can track back to that, right? So I would love to say, oh, no, by the time I got to my first corporate job, that, I was clear on my voice, and, you know, I had friends or a following. And I no, the truth is I didn't. So it really unfolded during my early part of my life, and it unfolded over time. But that being painfully shy and somewhat insecure, definitely insecure, right? Having my own insecurities, was definitely there. So
Hmm.
this has all come over time. Over time, it's a process to find your voice.
So, having been recognized for the things that you've been recognized for, and being in positions of influence around this topic of race and diversity, um, what kind of, I feel like it's got to feel like a weighty responsibility. I mean, would you agree with that? Does it feel like a weighty responsibility, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think if the question is there a weight or a heaviness in the work that we do around diversity and addressing systemic racism in the workplace, you know, um, I don't necessarily feel the weight of it in the work.
Mm-hmm.
I do feel the heaviness of just that it's a thing, and it's an experience that in the world that we live in this country, one of the wealthiest in the world, that we have issues of differences, issues of race, systemic racism, and racism, against all people, but absolutely Black people in such a different way that there's just no comparison. So I do feel the weight of that and the heaviness of
Mm.
being a Black woman. But I don't feel the weight in the work. I feel really empowered in the work that we get, that I and my company, we get to be part of the solution.
Mm.
So yeah. Um, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That does make sense. So I think that one of the things that I've heard you talk about is that there has been an evolution in the way that we talk about and approach diversity and engagement. And you're calling it something like 3.0 right now, or can you share with us what that means and what you've
Sure.
seen?
Sure. So I would say, in terms of diversity and inclusion 3.0, um, as of May 25th, or, we like to say May 27th, 2020, May of 2020, after George Floyd was murdered, corporate America, for the very first time, did something that they had never done before. And that is acknowledging that Black lives do matter, um, acknowledging and identifying or amplifying we are anti-racist, and that had never been done. And so that was a shift in corporate America, and we call that shift diversity and inclusion 3.0, at the diversity tipping point. So we coined the term the diversity tipping point, and that was May of 2020, after George Floyd was murdered, God rest his soul. And that's where, for the very first time, Black people in corporate America could be Black and just identify as Black. Because prior to that, Andrea, before it was DNI 3.0, you can be and identify or really amplify your Blackness beyond the Black ERG or the Black BRG, the Employee Resource Group. So there is in many companies in this country have, they start with an ERG. And so DNI 3.0, at the onset of this, we call it the diversity tipping point, and it essentially means we were and are amid a global reckoning of racism against Black people in this country. It was global because around the planet, people were protesting in outrage as a result of one individual, or really several individuals, Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. But it was really just where the linchpin, certainly pulled from the grenade. And so that is how we define DNI 3.0, because prior to DNI 3.0, the season that we were in was a focus on gender diversity, where women were leading in diversity and inclusion. Women were the focus. It was gender diversity at DNI 2.0. And gender diversity, as a result of that was the post hashtag Me Too movement. So an outcome of hashtag Me Too were women really winning and stepping up, and there being a huge receptivity to gender diversity. But at the diversity tipping point, which is 3.0, the focus became race and ethnicity, and specifically, Black talent, Black community. And so that is what we mean by DNI 3.0, the diversity tipping point, where companies really then focus their efforts on Black communities, large donations, and charitable giving for and to civil rights organizations and social justice organizations. Definitely a unifying time in this country to some extent. I like to see it that way, where it was an all hands on deck. People of all races, all backgrounds were protesting to say, this is insane. And so that's D&I 3.0.
Hmm. The um, going from 2.0 to 3.0, from the way that you described that, it sounds a little bit also like that the people who are in focus are feeling empowered to be able to share their voice and are actually feeling a little bit more heard. Would you agree that that's what's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more that, prior to this, there had been movements to try and get or to amplify voices. And none of the movements had the reaction that we were able to see, um, in May of 2020. And I think it was largely because of it was a perfect storm, Andrea. I mean, the most unprecedented time, because I've been asked, well, why do you think that happened? And what happened? Because certainly, Black people have been killed prior to that and on camera. But why? And it was a perfect storm because the entire world was shut down. The world was shut down and the world had time on their hands. Nobody could go to work. We couldn't go out. And so you were forced to watch, right? And then the media, they just looped it, right? And so a perfect storm on a loop. Nobody could go anywhere. So you were watching. And mothers everywhere heard
Hmm.
they heard the voice of their child. All they heard is mom, and that pierced the hearts of women everywhere and dads and people. So anyway,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah,
So what are you seeing happen in a very practical way in companies now? How is this actually making a difference now? What are they trying to do?
yeah, I think it's making a difference now because we are, um, we're moving on, but corporations are looking at themselves. They were initially making a lot of external or putting a lot of external energy um, into like consumer engagement and corporate and social responsibility and private public partnerships and everything that was externally facing. I think what we're seeing now is organizations are making commitments internally as well, which is where there is a big flag and a big miss. In fact, a lot of corporations were getting some criticism about performative D&I, where they were doing everything because it was the requisite thing to do to apologize. You better say something about Black people. And yeah, so we are seeing organizations to double down and double back on their commitments to making their workplace a place where all people are welcome. So we do see that. I mean, that's some of the work that we do. So at Diverse and Engage, we are called in to do training, things from training. I hate to just say training because it's more than training that has to happen, but a lot of companies are focusing on educating their workforce. They're moving from things like bias training, which bias is not a diversity strategy. Bias training is not a strategy, and ERG is not a diversity strategy. But they're doing more things, at least with us. They call us because they know that we do the surface work and we do the systemic work, right? Surface work might be cultural competence, allyship. We have allyship, we have D&I champion programming specifically for executive level leaders. So we see more of that where before D&I 3.0, companies, some were focusing on that, but not all. We also are seeing more requests to go deeper, and that's new. More requests to look at systemic issues. So we have a tool, a methodology called TACE. It's the Amy Cooper effect, and just really using that as a model to acknowledge, denounce, and dismantle systemic racism.
Within
So
the
follow
company? itself.
within the corporations. We go
Yeah.
into corporations. So, and for those who may not be aware, now certainly Amy Cooper was a story that also unfolded on the same day that George Floyd was murdered. Amy Cooper and the story of Christian Cooper, Amy Cooper, a white woman who used her whiteness as a weapon to call police on, a black man who could have lost his life. I mean, that's a story. And Andrea, you may or may not know this, but that just pierced our hearts as Black people, because I don't know if your listeners are familiar with Emmett Till, but that what Amy Cooper did, um, it's a cultural, it's a trigger of sorts, because Emmett Till was a young boy who was killed because of a similar thing that happened in the 60s.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
you see how it's just anyway. But we use that as a model. And what I mean by that is, Amy Cooper worked in corporate America. She worked for a super conservative hedge fund, Wall Street firm, and they released her. They fired her. Now, Amy Cooper had apologized, so let's just say that. But they fired her. Now, I'm going to do a sidebar here, Andrea, because they should have, but I could argue for all of us. I can argue for Black people and our Black community because I am Black, but I can also argue and make the case for women. Andrea, how about she got fired? She's a woman, but did you fire the man who did the same thing?
Hmm.
Right? Do you see what I'm saying? I could argue and make the case for women being the fall guy. Do you see where I'm going with
Uh,
this? Because Franklin Templeton has been criticized for, but they would allow for a white cisgender male to do the same thing, but they didn't fire him. But when it's a woman, do you see what I'm saying?
so I do. Is part of the reason, and I really get that. Is part of the reason why because she was caught on camera? Is that part of it? Do you
That
think?
she was fine. I
Yeah.
think so. I think
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. But like I said, I can argue both of being a Black woman, but I can also argue the point for women that you fired her because she's a woman. You didn't fire. We've already had these issues. This has come up before, but you didn't
Right.
fire John. You didn't fire Bob, but you were going to fire Amy. Let her be the fall guy. So, but my point is, that what we learned from Amy Cooper is she worked in corporate America. So now we know that racism exists because she is an example of that. And now we just follow her path back to corporate America, her job, and all of the touch points of where she would have had influence. She would have been on sourcing or a hiring panel. So she would have made a decision if I was going in for a job. She would have been perhaps, if I went for a performance review, she probably, and I worked for Franklin Templeton, she was in that process. So, and then if I went for a promotion or a new job, she's probably in that process. So we have that as a framework, a model. It's called the TASTE methodology, where we look at 5 core areas to identify where there may be systemic racism that is contributing to what's showing up in corporate America and leading to the issues around diversity, hiring, promotion, right, performance appraisals and reviews, and so on and so forth. So we're seeing, and I'm going to go back to your original question, we are seeing corporations raise their hand for, we need to go deeper and we need to address racism internally. So that's what we're
Mm.
seeing.
Mm.
Yeah.
To have them say we're going to put time and energy and resources toward something that's deeper, not just throw a training at it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Training's good, but
It is. It is. But it doesn't fix our current issues. It's definitely racism. It's not. In fact, to be quite honest, Andrew, it's diversity and inclusion is really not the solution to where we are in this. It really isn't.
mm,
Diversity means it's representation. Inclusion just means the culture, the environment. That's it. It doesn't necessarily get to the core. So, but it's a process. It didn't take us, a year to get to where we are now in terms of systemic racism in the workplace. So it's not going to take us a year. It's unreasonable for us to think that all will be well overnight. It just isn't. It's going to be a process. So we have to start baby steps. If you all look, corporate America wants to address diversity and inclusion. Okay, so we start there or we go back there. If they want to address, culture, inclusion, and belonging. Okay, Andrea, some organizations are looking at justice, equity, diversity and inclusion. This new acronym is called JEDI, right? And I'll just say this. We don't need to get caught up in what we call it. Just fix it. Because it doesn't matter where you put the diversity or where you put the inclusion. Is it I&D, D&I? Is it JEDI? Is it culture? Is it inclusion? It doesn't matter. These are language. It's labels and language, and it just doesn't matter. Yeah.
So if diversity inclusion isn't the answer, but you're willing to start there, I understand that. Yeah. What is the answer?
Yeah, the answer is it's a process that is going to take time over time, but it really is addressing, I'm going to say acknowledging, denouncing and dismantling systemic racism. Because what that does is, Andrea, and I'll just say this to you as my white girl sister friend,
Please.
Which I love that we have stayed together and connected over the few years since we met and had dinner and because systemic racism gets beyond if the issue is an Amy Cooper, right? It gets beyond if Amy Cooper is racist. Systemic racism just looks at the system, not the people. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to give you an example because when you're asking the question, where do we start? What will fix it? You have to address the system. So let's look at policing. So I've been in conversations around reimagining the police or defunding the police. Mm-hmm. And it's been a loving circle that I was in conversation with my white girl sister friends who put together a fireside community to support, really allies, right? They put together this loving community. And I said to them, let me give you perspective about police and policing and why you all are, for the first time, just seeing how Black people are really treated differently. It's because, Andrea, I don't know if you knew this, but they didn't know this. I said, guys, policing isn't broken. The policing system is not broken, and it doesn't need to be fixed because it's not broken. It's working the way it was designed to work. I'm going to say this again, just in case, because in that room, some of my white girl sister friends, they had husbands who were police, right? And so we want to take my girlfriend's husband out of the picture, that he is a police officer. He's a good guy, right? So we're saying policing, not police, policing. The system is working the way it was designed. Policing, the system was designed to catch runaway slaves. It's documented. That's the origins of policing. So the system is not broken. The system is working the way it was designed. My white girl sister friends, they said, Dee, how do you know that? I said, girl, it's documented. You could Google. It's not even hidden. I said, so just know that. So now the way it plays out is it's embedded into the system. So if you see, even Andrea, if you had a distant cousin or friend, your white brother, right, cousin, friend, now don't get me wrong, there are some who are racist, right? But there's some, Andrea, they work for a system that is racist. So when they see, they're naturally, so it's embedded. It's embedded. So when they naturally see a Black person, it's embedded. Their trigger is different. It's different than if they see a white person, because the system was designed. And even though we have civil rights acts and laws that, you know, um, um, you know, try attempted to right size Black people and slaves. There was never an effort to correct policing that was built on, if you see a Black person, D. Marshall Sheep, if you see her hanging out with Andrea, you are to get her back. Okay. And so there was never a process to fix that. It was just a law, but there was never a process. So, anyway, I don't want to belabor it, but I know that it's, at least my white sister friends and brothers, they say it's helpful to hear because we weren't taught, we weren't educated. And so I just want to say, even for people listening and you're shocked or you're feeling some kind of way, look, we are all in this together. A lot of this was not part of our history. It's painful, it's awkward, but we're here now. And what's helpful is that we just pick up these little nuggets as we go, right? And try to learn, all that we can and do better, or ask ourselves the question, what can I do? Or at least just being educated. It helps to validate and know, you know what, my experience or my privilege, I can't get defensive about it. But anyway, but I'm going to stop there, not to belabor it. But was that helpful, Andrea,
Oh,
in terms
right.
of?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Systemic racism, to be able to help people to see, including myself, but help everybody to be able to see how it was embedded and
Get it?
that it was birthed out of that
It was birthed
instead.
out of that.
And so there's a natural way that it grows up. I remember a couple years ago, I think maybe you had a post, and it was, you had taken a picture of yourself on the airplane, and you were talking about how a white woman, had asked you if you could trade seats so that she could sit by her friend.
Yes.
And I was so glad that you posted this because you had told her no. And then you proceeded to, on this post, you explained to us why you said no. And that was something that I didn't know or didn't understand or wouldn't have thought of until you said it. And I was so glad that you did. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. And thanks for asking, because this is how we learn. I also had one of my previous coaches, she said she did the same thing. And the woman responded and she said she felt horrible, but she didn't know. I mean, she was emotional. But the reason, and I'm getting emotional thinking about it, and this is, I think, a learning for all of us, because what naturally showed up in me, in my spirit, was a defense and like, how dare you? And here's why, Andrea. It's because we have cultural trauma. Although I didn't live in the 60s, right? And this is something that I think we're now learning. We as Black people have cultural trauma embedded. And it's literally a psychological term that says that embedded in our DNA is the trauma of slavery that it's transferred over generations, far removed from actually being slaves, that it's embedded in us, right? And so when she asked that, it was a trigger of um, her being entitled and a confrontation and how dare she and being less than. And I don't even know that on the surface that bothers me. I think what's showing up is cultural trauma of how, just remembering, right? We were um, deemed less than, a third less or third part human. And so that's what that meant. Like, because I'd given up my seat when I've seen parents with kids, or if I saw you and your honey. Let me tell you how that would have worked differently, Andrea. If I saw you and your honey and I saw y'all separate, I would say, I don't mind switching seats with you. I promise you, I've done that before.
Yeah.
But the audacity of her asking, it came from a place of entitlement. and it triggered something. So that's what that was about. It triggered something that she would ask me and inconvenience me as if I don't matter because she wants to sit with her friend. Do you see? There's a lot coming up. But if they were talking over the seats, it could have been, I'd offer, but let me offer. But when you say, in fact, let me say this for anybody, everybody who's listening who may not understand it. When you ask a Black person to get up, they could be Gen Z. If they react in a kind of way, it could be cultural trauma from the bus boycott and when Harriet Tubman was asked to give up her seat and arrested. And so that's what shows up where we don't even know it, but we get there's a little nervous energy. And because this could go, Andrea, and you know what, I'm feeling emotional now because nowadays, that sort of encounter, and then if I decline or if I say something awkward, today, that's getting us arrested and killed. Like, we can't today in 2021, when we make a wrong move, and it's resulting today in us losing our lives. And, you know, I thank you. And I love that you are inviting this courageous conversation on the Voice of Influence podcast. I do. And I love that we can have it as friends and colleagues, like, you know, but yeah, so that's what that meant. And I posted, and you know what? I've also shared feedback when, let's say, a white person has asked me to do something or done something offensive. I have also shared, hey, I just want to let you know that if this was another person, it could play out differently. I have lovingly said that, whether it's a bump or whether it's a offense or something that I know was innocent, it was not intentional. I said, hey, I just want to let you know. And that is like assuming that I work at the store. Like, I've been asked that. Where is the so-and-so? Excuse me, why would you be asking me that? And then just sharing, because I knew it was an educational moment. And I knew that if I was a different kind of Black woman, you would see how we're pitched or how we are presented in media. She's an angry Black woman. And so now, and for folks who are listening, and if this is an opportunity to learn, just think about how that term angry Black women, if you've ever heard that. So now you know, oh, they're not angry. What's showing up is there's tension in the world that we live in. And let me just say this to level set. We are living in the best of times. I'm going to say that for raising the vibration. We live in one of the wealthiest countries on the planet. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else, but we are living in a tense time and season that is for people on the outside looking in. They just wouldn't imagine, like, wait, y'all have racism? What? So anyway.
Oh gosh.
I know
Yeah. It's so good though. I mean, it's so important, and it's so good to you know, when people are struggling, you know, when somebody's struggling, what's our natural instinct? Our natural instinct is to be there for them, to hopefully be there for them.
Yeah.
And as a society, we have to acknowledge that that is what is happening. There is a struggle. And so I have heard people talk about, you know, why, you know, all lives matter, that sort of thing. And, but not all lives are struggling in the same way. And it is so important for us to understand and or try to understand and give voice to, be an ally to those who are. So as far as the being an ally, what would you like to share with the audience about, and me, about being an ally?
Yeah, I think just being mindful that um, one, there's a great sense of appreciation for allies that are showing up in the season. Like, I think that's first, that and that allies mean well and are well intentioned. I think that's a second. Like, just I want allies to know this, there's a great appreciation. Definitely. We that's what I mean by this was an all hands on deck battle, fight, and protest. That's clear. That's clear. But I think in addition, because some would say, right, in the Black community, we've been dealing with this forever. And so now that y'all are woke, don't expect for us to just welcome you with open arms and to be nice and kind and kumbaya. So that's why I wanted to level set and say, we're grateful. There are many of us that are grateful and see it like it's definitely, the allies they're pissed off. Like, in fact, I'm going to be quite honest. That was good to see.
Oh, I bet.
It's good for me to see my white brothers and sisters pissed, angry, woke, and like, what in the hell? What? That that alone made me emotional. Now, others of my colleagues would be like, well, I'm not impressed, do something. So, but I do want to know, great appreciation, great respect for, yep, show up. But here's the caution and then the advice, like being very mindful of performative. Allies need to be very mindful of performative allyship.
Mm.
Allies be very mindful of being front and center and making it about them. The wall of white moms meant well. They did well. These were all of the moms last year out in the protest, white moms with bright yellow shirts. They meant well and did well. I think they got a lot of criticism, and then they course corrected. They recognized that they were never to be out in front
Mm.
of the protest, but to stand with. I think that was the lesson. And so for allies, right, to stand with, right? It's like, I don't identify as part of this community, but I stand side by side with. And that's what allyship is. I'm not behind, I'm not in front of, but I'm going to stand with. I don't identify with the Black community, but I stand with. That's allyship. And making sure that it's not a one off. I think
Mm.
that's a big thing. It's not a one off. It's not an act. It's just who you become, that you become as part of your hard wiring. You have the ability and the lens to see differences and lived experiences of the Black community, Black people, Latinas, Latinx community, underrepresented individuals, and interrupt the bias and interrupt, right, racism. Also, what's important for allies to know is talk to your white people friends. Don't just talk to the people who are right, who are the Black community or underrepresented individuals. No, have these conversations with your white people friends. Interrupt it. Stop supporting financially, racist companies, racist brands, racist people. That's a big one, because those whom you ally for will want to know still and challenge you on where you're spending your money, how you're spending your time. So now it's no longer about allies doing for or standing with the Black community and other underrepresented individuals. It's about how is your actions on the other side, how you're spending your time and how you're spending your money. Are you spending your money with brands that are known? That speaks. And then making sure it's not performative, making sure you're stepping up over time to support and not a one-off, and standing with.
Mm.
And then the last thing that I'll say is, because one of my clients were doing some allyship work, and we rolled out this whole allyship framework, which has three pieces to the framework. And one is, allies should understand historical context, so that they are familiar with not everything, but at least they understand, that the Black community, and again, any other whom you're allying for, that there are some very sensitive areas that you want to be aware of. So it could be asking, asking somebody to get up, right? Just recognizing that and why that might be a sensitivity. A comment about hair. There's a big issue around hair and textured hair, and lots of other things historically. Understanding that the world we live in, the systems were all built on white supremacy, because the country was built before slavery. You have to understand, like, everything was really built on that. So understanding historical context, understanding not everything, not all things, but the top headlines, understanding, and then understanding and accepting your own privilege, understanding your own privilege. And although for, my white brothers and sisters, understanding you may not, you weren't part of the committee to bring slaves here, right? You were not part of that. You didn't sign on for that. In fact, you're pissed at your ancestors. You're pissed that you even have that in your backstory. You're pissed, but you recognize that where you are was a beneficiary. Right. And so just recognize, so that is important for allies to understand. You're a beneficiary. So never dismissing that racism exists, understanding historical context, accepting, that racism is real, having those conversations in your own circles, making sure it's not performative, making sure it's not a one-off. I tell this too. I have a girlfriend, Lindsay, and Lindsay she's white girl champion of all things Black. I mean, she is just so she gets so riled up. But I always like to tell the story of Lindsay and I, because she's a big supporter, ally to the 10th power. She is. And I tell people, and I've told her, Lindsay, in the 60s, we were friends and we were girls, and you in the inner city, and then the suburbs were built, right? This is The Color of Law, the book, right? You went out to the suburbs, and then you convinced your mom, we want to let Dee and her family, they should move in the house next to her. Lindsay, do you understand? You would not be allowed, legally, you were not allowed to sell me the house next to you. And if you worked for the mortgage bank, Lindsay, you were not allowed. And so when I give that context, then, it's helpful to understand the systemic racism, and also to then understand your privilege, right? Because, The Color of Law paints the picture of how wealth was built in this country, and why there's such disparities between people of color, and Black people in particular, and white people. It was built on the systemic racism of redlining, of where we were all together, and then the suburbs were built, and then you bought the home. Black people were able to afford it. We were not allowed. And then the equity, this is the beginning of wealth. Equity built or obtained in that home was then transferred to the children, and then able to afford healthcare, able to afford education, Ivy League schools. And meanwhile, Black folks were over there. They could have afforded at the time. We could have afforded that. We were already prosperous. And so for allies, just helpful to know, top line, you don't have to have a PhD in this. We're all going to make mistakes. So I know that was a long-winded response, but I hope that's helpful for the allyship case. And you know what? I'll share this last thing I heard from a woman, and she was a white woman, and she, of course, she shared this, and I thought it was so powerful. And she shared this with other white people. She said, "You know what? I'm here as an ally." But I recognize I cannot speak for Black people. And so I said, yep, definitely know that you can't speak for Black people and others. Bring us to the table. Let us speak for ourselves. Don't do that. Bring us to the table. Give us the platform. Hire us. Recommend us. Right? Partner with us. But she said something. I was so proud of her. She said, Dee, I was in a room on Clubhouse, and it was on a touchy topic. And I got up, and she said, and the people criticized me, and they were not here for me as a white woman. And I love that she did this. She said, you know what, Dee? And I understood it. She said, I sat down, I sat back, and I stayed in the room. And she said to them, And yes, you're right. And I'm going to keep on coming back. And that's what it takes to be uncomfortable. This is a sticky place, an awkward place. But I love that she said, and she knew it's bad, but she knew it was from the pain of this country. But she said, because she's a real ally, she said, and I'm going to keep on coming back.
Mm.
And I just thought it was so powerful. So I'll end on that.
Oh, I love that. Love it. Okay. Uh, Dee, thank you. Thank you for being here, for sharing your voice and your message with our audience. And thank you for the continued work that you do to make the world a better place. And I just know that I'm both cheering you on, and as I can think of things and come across things and ways to be an ally, I certainly hope to be. And would you share with the audience where they can connect with you, where they can find you? What would you like to let them know?
Yeah, I love this. I'm hugging you, my friend, and I'm so glad we're connected. I love that this is not just me as a guest on the Voice of Influence, but that this is a continuation of our relationship, that we actually know each other, right?
Yeah.
Like I just love that. And I want to thank you. I want to thank you for creating this and just you stepping into your space, to be quite honest. So thank you for inviting me. I wanted to do this. Remember, I'm like, nope, I'm getting on our calendar. We're gonna chat. And I just thank you for being so open with this. I mean, and I'll share as I wrap and where folks can find. I didn't even know that our conversation would even go over to this, like, but I think it's good. I think this is what needed to come through. But I think yeah, it's what needed to come through rather than me, talking about, I've had a great life. I mean, I'm having a good life. I'm having a great life. And I even realized that I'm going to go back to this one point and wrap. But when I was sitting in the White House, I had 6 years Obama White House access. And when I was sitting in the White House, and I remembered that Michelle Obama introduced us to American history lesson that we didn't know, that my ancestors built this house. I've been to the White House several times, but to the Obama's holiday party. And I remember going into the powder room, the first lady's powder room, and like my ancestors built this house. And it was just so powerful. So I didn't know that our story would go here, but I think this was necessary, and it was a sweet space of us as friends just to have this conversation and to help the listeners. And I'm so glad, and I'm believing that folks who are listening were able to take away one thing so that we can all continue this journey together. So in terms of where folks can find me, I am everywhere online at Dee C Marshall. It's DEEC Marshall, everywhere online. I I hang out for business on LinkedIn, of course, at Dee C Marshall. But I play on Instagram. I like IG the most. It's more of me and my personality. www.diverseandengage.com or www.dcmarshall.com is where you can find everything about Dee C Marshall. So thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea. And I love being here. And yeah, until next time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for being a voice of influence.